This video is part 2 of an explanation of Louis Althusser's ideological state apparatuses, repressive state apparatuses, and how they relate to structuralism ideology and the production of knowledge and power. I'm D. Elizabeth Glasgow, and I'm your lecturer for this series. Althusser's concept of interpellation. Althusser formulated a concept called interpellation to distinguish how ideologies and ISAs, or ideological state apparatuses, work together. If you're confused about the difference between ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses, please check out our previous video, part 1. In the relationship between what we believe and practice, we think of belief as preceding practice. We believe something and then we act on it or practice it. But Althusser argued just the opposite. We act on something and then we believe it. He gave the example of individuals kneeling at the altar in churches. In the usual way of thinking, people kneel in church because they believe in God. In this way, every subject possesses some form of consciousness and acts freely according to his or her own beliefs. Althusser argued, however, that we believe because we kneel, that kneeling is a ritual that makes up one of the many material practices of ideological apparatuses. To Althusser's mind, this meant that ideas in and of themselves have disappeared, while their existence is embedded in the actions or practices governed by rituals. These practices or rituals are defined by ideological state apparatuses. With interpellation, institutions like the mass media, school, community organizations, and others influence individuals through peer pressure, rewards, and enforcement to think and accept, or reject for that matter, identities, relationships, and connections to social institutions. In Althusser's formulation, the individual is always already a subject. He is never autonomous, fully coherent, or actualized. Rather, human agency is an illusion, an ideological construction meant to further the agendas of capitalism. So, ISAs impose subjectivities on individuals, but encourage those individuals to think that those subjectivities are self-generated. So, interpellation by ISAs operate in the service of instilling meaning systems within individuals that allow them to accept or celebrate capitalist exploitation. Now, Althusser's critics like Gramsci and others contradict this. Althusser's critics have generally centered on the lack of human agency or free will in Althusser's theorizing. Human beings are not of a hive mind, they say. Contradictory and fragmented consciousness allows every person to enmesh him or herself into social structures that bind them to specific identities. These critics believe that, however insightful Althusser's contributions are, they answer a critical line of inquiry inefficiently. How does one account for resistance by subversion? In his 1983 essay, one of his critics, Stuart, wrote, "It was Althusser who had displaced so thoroughly the base superstructure metaphor. In fact, the doors he opened provided precisely the exit points through which many abandoned the problematic of the classical Marxist theory of ideology altogether. They gave up not only Marx's particular way in the German ideology of coupling ruling class and ruling ideas, but the very preoccupations with the class structuring of ideology and its role in the generation and maintenance of hegemony. Take, for example, the extremely tricky ground of the distortions of ideology and the question of false consciousness. Now, it is not difficult to see why these kinds of formulations have brought Marxist critics bearing down on him. Distortions open immediately the question as to why some people, those living their relation to their conditions of existence through the categories of a distorted ideology, cannot recognize that it is distorted, while we, with our superior wisdom, or armed with properly formed concepts, can. Are the distortions simply falsehoods? Are they deliberately sponsored falsifications? If so, by whom? Does ideology really function like conscious class propaganda? And if ideology is the product or function of the structure rather than of a group of conspirators, how does an economic structure generate a guaranteed set of ideological effects? The terms are clearly unhelpful as they stand. they make both the masses and the capitalists look like judgmental dupes. They also entail a particular and peculiar view of the formation of alternative forms of consciousness. Presumably, they arise as scales fall from people's eyes, or as they wake up, as if from a dream, and all at once see the light, glance directly through the transparency of things, immediately to their essential truth, their concealed structural processes. Stuart Hall's criticism here is a general criticism levied against Althusser almost uniformly, that his theorizing does not account for self-actualization or self-determination. People are not dupes. They are not of a hive mind. They are the products of their upbringings, however varied those may be. So you will see throughout, when criticism of Althusser arises, it generally falls in the lack of insight into human struggle, how individuals struggle against dominant institutions. Now let's talk briefly about identity and subjectivity in Althusser's work. In his essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Althusser was heavily influenced by the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan's theories of the way the human subject is created through social interaction. We'll talk about Lacan's importance to Marxist philosophy in another upcoming video. In Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Althusser described a process of subjectification, where an individual becomes what Althusser calls a knowing subject, one who is part of a sovereign, rational, and unified consciousness. So the individual thinks and speaks and is the author of meaning. This is the common sense definition of a subject. However, Althusser argued that through the process of interpellation, the individual becomes an agent of ideology. The person becomes subjected to ideology. That is to say, individuals are acclimated to ideologies and ideological practices to such an extent, when it works well, that they start to live it as if ideological practices were a natural and obvious state of being. Althusser argues that ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs, again, which are churches, schools, law enforcement agencies, culture, and the media, produce the ideologies within which subjectivities are constituted. Of course, the usual criticism of Althusser again applies here, as Althusser gives little credence to individual and collective self-reflection and self-actualization. Despite this criticism, an important one to be sure, Althusser's theories about subjectivity furthered along thinking about how language, meaning, and power intersect with subjectivity and identity. Although Althusser's theories offer an important intervention in the Marxian analysis of ideology, applying his theories have been somewhat less than useful to the study of Marxist theorizing, because they do not address how individuals subvert and or resist systems of domination, and they do not explain how that contestation arises. This has been and continues to be Althusser's Achilles heel. I'm D. Elizabeth Glasgow. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.